to another parable, a parable of a banquet, a parable of a meal, a very different one. I have a confession to make, actually. I saw the heading for the passage that we are studying today, and I said, oh, it's the parable of the banquet. That's the one that we studied last summer in Church in the Small in the book of Luke, about the man whose dinner guests don't show up, and so he invites the poor and the disabled people to his banquet. I love this one. It's going to be so easy to talk about. But we're not studying Luke today, we're studying Matthew, and Matthew's version of this parable has very little in common with Luke's version. You can go compare the two after, it's in Luke 14, but Matthew's version is a lot more violent and a lot weirder. So I knew I was in trouble when I realized this. I mean, what causes differences like these in scripture? Differences between two versions of a similar story? Did Matthew and Luke remember the parable differently? Or did Jesus tell two variations on the same story for different contexts? Hard to say. In Luke, Jesus is at a dinner party, so it makes sense. But here he's at the temple in Jerusalem, where he's just entered on a donkey and knocked over all the tables of the money changers and is now being challenged head on by the high priests, the chief priests. They want to arrest him, but instead they get up in his face and they say, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you that authority? You can cut the tension with a knife. Jesus doesn't exactly answer their question. He starts talking about his cousin John and John's baptism, and he asks them a question about where John got his authority, and that puts them in an awkward spot. And then Jesus tells three stories, three parables, and this one we're looking at is the last parable. So just like we did with the story of Little Cliff, we're going to try to immerse ourselves in this world of a different kind of story and try to get our imagination going. So if you want to keep your eyes closed while Jim reads this, Jim, you can't close your eyes, unfortunately, but he's going to read it off the screen. This is from Matthew 22, and just try to immerse yourself in the world of this parable. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, Matthew 22, I can't read this. Matthew 22, verses 1 to 14 in the New Revised Standard Version. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burnt their city. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Jim. Well, I promised parables were punches in the gut, and that is definitely a punch in the gut. It's definitely mysterious, definitely unclear, makes us want to ask a lot of questions. Check, check, check. And earlier I said that with parables, it's best to avoid assuming that certain characters stand for specific people or things. But this parable contains so much weird stuff, so much unexpected in terms of what's part of it, that it's been hard for interpreters not to try to make it into an allegory, to try to make things stand for other things. Many interpreters of this parable have thought carefully about the particular situation of Matthew, the guy who wrote all of this down. Matthew was written after the Romans burned down Jerusalem in 70 AD. He was writing at a time when Christians were being severely persecuted. So people think maybe Matthew's trying to bolster his hurting community in the way that he remembers and tells this story. In this more traditional interpretation, the king is God, the son is Jesus, although he doesn't really do much in this story, and the banquet is the heavenly messianic wedding banquet at the end of time. And the first invitees are the Israelites, the Jews, but they ignore the invitation and kill the prophets who are represented by the king's slaves. So God the king lets the city of Jerusalem burn to the ground, which is exactly what happened in the year 70 AD, and instead invites the Gentiles, the early church, the good and the bad, as guests. But these new guests can't get too complacent. They have to be sure that they're wearing the right clothes, that they're putting on Christ, to use a phrase of Paul's, like clothing, and living a life worthy of the gospel. Or they're going to share Israel's fate and be thrown out, because many are called, but few are chosen. So this ties up some loose ends. It explains some weird stuff. It would have both encouraged and challenged Matthew's community. I said that parables can mean different things to different people, and I don't think we need to agree on what they mean, but I do think we need to examine the effects of our interpretations. And I do think we're responsible to follow them to their ethical conclusions. So what are the side effects? What are the effects of this traditional reading? Some things I've noticed is that it can encourage an attitude of Christian triumphalism, that we're the ones who made it into the banquet at the end, the church won. And at worst, it can promote dangerous anti-Semitic thinking, which we were triggered earlier to think about, where we paint Jewish people as these killers of prophets, as people not worthy of the kingdom or who deserve the destruction that they're given. What's even worse for me, though, is the way that it affects our image of God. So if the king is a stand-in for God, we see a very violent God, a God who seems to want everyone to preserve his honor, to suck up to him. And when they don't, he erupts in a murderous rage. And it's not just a battle where he's killing people who have directly harmed him. He's setting a whole city on fire. He's destroying innocent bystanders. It's a God whose invitations the second time around seem driven less by love and hospitality and more by a need to avoid shame and to fill his hall with guests and reassert his honor. A God who gives the death penalty for a dress code mistake. So are we supposed to kind of sweep these things under the rug and see if we can just take out some nuggets of truth? I think we can't avoid asking, is this a king? Is this a God who's worthy of our worship and our allegiance? This king sounds less like the God I know and more like someone like Vladimir Putin. Or maybe if I were in Jesus's audience, he'd sound more like a Mediterranean king. Someone perhaps like Herod the Great, the king who was ruling when Jesus was born. An extremely insecure king, as we saw in the story of the wise men, when Herod tried to kill all children under 2 years old in order to try to kill Jesus. This week, I learned more about the roots of this king's deep insecurity. Now, this might seem like a rabbit trail, but try to stick with me and see if any of this sounds like it connects to our parable. Herod the Great's own people didn't accept him as king at the beginning. The Romans say, hey, Israel, Herod the Great is going to be your king now, and the Jews do not like this plan because Herod is not fully Jewish. And besides, they've already chosen their favored ruler, the guy named Antigonus II, and this guy is trying to work for their independence from Rome. They like him. But their opinion doesn't matter because Herod has the whole Roman army behind him, and he lays siege to the city of Jerusalem and eventually conquers it after a few months and bursts in and starts murdering people in the city that he's about to rule. And he hears that this guy Antigonus, who was their ruler, is hidden in the temple with his loyal subjects in the center of the city. But Antigonus doesn't want the Roman soldiers to defile the temple, so he sacrifices himself. He surrenders himself to stop Herod and save the temple, and he's bound hand and foot and taken prisoner. Herod pays off the Romans so that they'll have him beheaded to ensure that none of his descendants will challenge his throne. And directly afterward, Herod marries the daughter of a leading Jewish family to try to legitimize himself in the people's eyes. Herod would have likely thrown some sort of wedding feast or victory banquet for anyone who survived his massacre. And all of this happened within the lifetimes of many of the people listening to Jesus that day. Interesting context. Jesus is literally standing in the temple, the place where Antigonus surrendered himself, which most people called Herod's temple because of major renovations that Herod the Great had started. And when the priests are asking Jesus to defend his authority, he brings up his cousin John, who was beheaded by the son of Herod the Great. And this is the Herod that Jesus himself is about to be face to face with only a few days later when he's arrested and crucified. So whether it's Herod the Great that is being referenced or hinted at here, or just a more generic king, I think it's clear that the original audience of this parable was familiar with kings like this. Brutal dictators who are obsessed with control and afraid of revolt, whose protocols and decorum are just this thin veneer over this violence that's kind of brewing under the surface. This was their world. And though some of the trappings have changed, in many ways, it's still our world. Power is still hoarded. Violence is still waiting under the surface. So what do we do with this story? Where do we find good news here? Let me share how I've been learning to see it in a fresh way by telling you this parable through someone else's eyes with some of my own embellishments. And then we're going to let you discuss it, discuss what you make of it. So I invite you to close your eyes as I play out this scene one more time. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven can be compared and contrasted with the ways of the human kings on earth. Human kings who deal in honor and shame, in fear and scapegoating. But there is a man from among the people, a man who dressed in ordinary clothes. And the man watched as the people were oppressed by a king like this. The man watched as they lost respect for this king, as they realized his promises were false, his justice was a sham. The man watched them refuse to attend the king's banquet in protest, how they ignored him, how they mimicked the king's violence, the cycle of violence by killing his servants. And the man watched as the king resorted to more and more lethal force in vain attempt to hold his grip on power. Then this king rounded up the survivors of his anger in the streets. They're probably in the streets because their houses had burned down, and he invited them to his wedding banquet. But having seen what he did to the last invitees, who's going to think twice about refusing that invitation? The man himself was rounded up with the rest of them and was brought to the door of a banquet hall, where they were providing everyone a tunic to pull over their street clothes, as was the custom for wedding banquets in that time and place. But the man couldn't pretend to honor a tyrant king. Once he was inside, he removed the wedding clothes. He felt the need to stand with everyone who doesn't wear the right clothes, everyone who doesn't have the right skin or the right papers, everyone who is trampled down by systems of power. It was the best way for him to quietly revolt, to take the attention off the king, take the attention of the king off the other guests and onto himself. And when the king came to inspect his so-called guests, to make sure all protocols were being followed for his honor, the man without the proper clothes stood out like a sore thumb. The king thought, perfect, I need a sacrifice, I need a victim, a common enemy who can unite my guests to further prove my authority. He said to the man with a fake kind of smile, friend, how did you get in here without the proper clothes? And the man in the ordinary clothes didn't answer. He was speechless before his ranting accuser. He would not defend himself to imperial powers. So he was bound hand and foot. He was cast to the utter darkness. For me, reading this parable in this way makes sense of the context, challenges me, compels me to be similar, and doesn't result in a violent image of God or force me into the kind of theological gymnastics to try to find some good in this king figure. Now, I was trying to deliberately avoid painting Jesus into this story. This man without the clothes could be any of us, but I think it's hard to see this man and not think of Jesus. Jesus, who's currently being asked, by what authority do you do this? And who gave you that authority? It sounds a lot like, where are your wedding clothes? Jesus, who would not give them a straight answer, who even after his arrest remains silent when put on trial, who's compared to a lamb silent before the slaughter, who's bound hand and foot to a cross, cast into utter darkness. Even the sun is darkened in a place of weeping women, gnashing of teeth of his persecutors. Many are called, but few, in fact, only one is chosen. And that one is the Son of Man, who doesn't play our violent games, but rather submits to suffer under our violent regimes, to become the scapegoat who exposes our senseless violence and then forgives us, breaking the power of violence and death and redeeming us and giving us abundant life. By what authority does he do this? I think Jesus is about to show them. His consent to die, his forgiveness, his resurrection, the authority he has to prepare us for a wedding banquet where all are invited. To me, that's the good news of this parable. But you might read it and see it in a different way. It's a parable. It's meant to be kind of confusing and mysterious. So we want to give you some time. We're doing something a bit different today, something maybe more reminiscent of some of our church in the small gatherings. Partly because Caitlin and I were both preaching this morning. We wanted to try a different approach today and not do quite as long of a sermon, but instead give you the chance to have some discussions together about this parable. So how do you hear this parable? Which reading do you lean toward? Or do you have another way of understanding it, of making sense of it? What do you do when a story presents an image of God that you wrestle with? How does it all make you feel? We're going to take about 10 minutes, maybe a little less, to discuss this in breakout rooms. And again, those who have done church in the small, I am trusting you to keep these conversations going in the way that you know how. Sometimes these conversations are intimidating, but I believe that God trusts us with these scriptures for a reason. I think we're allowed to wrestle with them together, like Jewish rabbis do so often. And we don't need to be experts. We can all contribute something because each of us has this unique combination of identities and life stories and perspectives. So even if you feel tentative, I would challenge you to offer something. And if you tend to take up more space in a conversation, maybe try to make a little space for others to say something. If you get stuck, I'm going to send you 3 ways to start a sentence, and I'll put it in the breakout rooms. But I wonder, it can be a question about the passage, or I noticed some detail that maybe I didn't even pick up on, or this is how this makes me feel. So I wonder, I notice, I feel. Enjoy the conversation. It's okay if it takes some rabbit trails and goes in different directions. And a reminder that the parable is found in Matthew 22, if you want to look it up and be able to reference it again. So again, if you don't want us to throw you into a breakout room, we're going to take, let's say, 8 minutes. Please change your name. So if you can rename yourself and put a little star, and that way when Tuesday's making the rooms, she'll know not to put you in one of them, or you can just ignore the invitation when it comes up and just stay in this room and chill out for the next 8 or 9 minutes. We'll give you a warning when you have a minute left. So enjoy the conversation, and then we'll come back here and have some prayer and communion together.